3000, you're cleared en route. 404 172 at 2500.
Alright, clear for takeoff.
It's time for Kris Cruz.
Hey guys, welcome back. And you know what? Season 2 is running, and we're going to continue talking about Stranger Things. You can be like, but why, Chris? We already harpooned this with Holly. But the reason I want to talk about Stranger Things on this episode again is because I want to see where they got their inspiration from. Because right now, you know, most of our TV shows are coming out. They're kind of pushing some kind of propaganda. And from what I learned about Stranger Things is that they're not pushing any propaganda. It's just something where you could just watch and forget about the world and kind of start thinking about the what our grandparents used to say, the good old days. So, Mark, thank you for joining us. And where does the show get their inspiration from?
Well, I mean, obviously there's a lot of references to 80s filmmakers in particular. There's a lot of Spielberg stuff, and there's a lot of John Carpenter stuff. I mean, the sort of neon theme song is like very similar to the John Carpenter synthesizer music that was in all of his horror films in the 80s. And very much, you know, the idea of, you know, Spielberg and E.T. is an obvious, you know, sort of thematic similarity if you've seen the show. So, you know, there's very much some sort of, you know, deliberate filming references. And there's been a lot of talk about that. And in fact, it's kind of hard to miss because like in the show, in the basement where all the boys play, there's like a poster for John Carpenter's The Thing on the wall in the background.
Yeah, there is. And
I mean, they're not exactly being subtle about where they're getting their inspiration from some of this stuff. But one thing I thought that was kind of neglected and people really haven't talked about as much is that a lot of the inspiration comes from sort of like 80s genre fiction, specifically, you know, 80s horror. Stephen King is an obvious reference. I mean, if you notice that the logo of the show is the exact same font that was used on, you know, literally millions of Stephen King paperbacks in the 80s, and a whole other, you know, a whole other bunch of horror fiction, you know, paperbacks in the 80s as well. And so that is very much an obvious inspiration.
Yeah, it's funny here because you talk about, you know, the mismatch of youthful wonder and adult horror, which is kind of, it's really interesting to see it because at the end of the day, this is just four kids, well, actually now 3 with a little girl, having an adventure that they did not seem to want to have. You also talk about that the body, that's the title, was the literally source material for the movie Stand By Me. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, if you've seen the movie Stand By Me, which, you know, tracks Stephen King's novella of the same name, you know, again, that was about 4 boys, you know, who are basically in a small town who are, you know, banding together against bullies, and they're, you know, dealing with sort of, they're coming of age, you know, dealing with adult violence. I mean, if you've seen Stand By Me, and obviously the whole thing centers around this quest to go find this dead body that's out in the woods, allegedly. And, you know, obviously, again, that's another sort of direct inspiration for Stranger Things. You have the bonding of the 4 boys, and you have them, you know, dealing with bullies in a small town, and like a lot of other similar themes. In fact, Stephen King tweeted out that watching Stranger Things was like watching the greatest hits of Stephen King, you know, referring to himself, and he said that's a compliment. And I think that's, you know, very true. I mean, that was very much what Stephen King was also doing, and why he was so beloved, is that he had this combination of adult horror and, you know, childlike wonder, you know, and you know, in small towns, and that was very much a sort of Americana thing, and Stranger Things is effectively tapped into that.
Oh, for sure. And here's one of the paragraphs that kind of like made me, I have to talk to you, because I'm 26 years old. I was born in '89, so I wasn't, you know, around the '80s, like the hardcore '80s. But you put here, which is really interesting, because you put, and I quote, "For me, Stranger Things was reminiscent of a personal few favorites." And then you talk about PlayStation 3 era, when the teenage boredom was more like grabbing a book other than, you know, going into like the TV and watching Netflix that we're right now. What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, I mean, fiction used to be a much more sort of deliberately escapist, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not to say that it isn't now, But, back in an era before PlayStations and Netflix and the internet and all of this, sometimes when you were bored, I mean, maybe you had seen almost every film at your local video store if you lived in a small town, and that was certainly the case for me. And so if you were looking for something, just to pass the time, you weren't necessarily looking for something to read that was like going to be objectively edifying. You were looking for something that was like really exciting and, purely, fantastical. And if you look at, the 80s horror fiction and 80s science fiction and just genre fiction in general from that era, you see that. You see like this very deliberate attempt to like reach out and grab readers and be as entertaining as possible. And I think that's kind of been lost. In the piece I mentioned, there's a great blog called Too Much Horror Fiction, where they actually this blog collects just like photos of old paperbacks, and it's just a lot of them are from the 80s, not all of them. Sometimes they go back further than that, but I mean it's just a trip to see these old things where you can see that they're like these paperbacks are like carnival barkers just trying to like get you to like read them by being as exciting and or lurid and or trashy as possible sometimes. And there's something in a weird sort of way to be said for that, where, people are writing very deliberately to be as entertaining as possible rather than to try and make some sort of, statement. I kind of, part of me kind of, misses that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's important to read edifying things, but at the same time, things that are very lurid nowadays are much more direct, pornography on the internet, other things like that. Whereas when that sort of stuff is couched in the context of a book thematically, I think it's easier to take and it's easier to grow up with, I should say, rather than, constantly being surrounded by things like internet porn.
No, and I totally agree because if, one of the things that I do, I go to a film school down here in Florida and, talking to all these, future filmmakers, they want to create, most of them, they want to bring back that old TV watching, where the family can gather together. Now, let's talk about the first book that you talk about, Summer of Night.
Yeah, I mentioned 3 books that I've read a lot of 80s sort of genre fiction over the years that sort of immediately leaped to my mind. And I don't know that these books necessarily inspired Stranger Things, but I do think that they're very reminiscent of the time period, and I thought of them when I was watching the show. The first one is called Summer of Night by a guy named Dan Simmons, who's very well known as a sci-fi writer and a horror writer, but primarily he wrote the Hyperion books, which were big bestsellers and already sort of sci-fi classics. But The Summer of Night is a horror novel about a bunch of boys in a small Illinois town who ride around on their bikes, and there's like this supernatural happening in their town. And it's just, very reminiscent of Stranger Things. I think it takes place in the 60s. But that book was written in, I think, 1990. I sort of technically included it, even though it wasn't in the 80s.
Yeah, 91.
Exactly.
Yeah, 91.
91. But, think about it, when that book was written, sort of this, at that time period, the 60s, were to that book what sort of the 80s are to like this period in terms of nostalgia, right? And so, again, it's just a very similar book. And then I wrote about another book, which is really kind of obscure, but it's become kind of a sort of small fan favorite on the internet. Is a book called Nightblood by a guy named Kris Martindale, which is, again, takes place in a small Indiana town, Isherwood, Indiana, which might as well be Hawkins, Indiana, if you read the book. So it's got that bit similarity right off the bat. But the story is about this guy who's a Vietnam vet who drifts around from town to town fighting supernatural forces with the help of his brother, who's a ghost, who didn't make it back from Vietnam. And he uses heavy weaponry to fight vampires and other supernatural happenings. And, of course, while he runs in this Indiana town, there's a big subplot involving this 11-year-old boy, again, same age as the guys in Stranger Things, and his brother, who are fighting bullies in their Indiana neighborhood. So it's very similar to Stranger Things in a lot of ways. And the book it's very 80s in the sense that, like, it's often described as Rambo meets Salem's Lot, but it's a lot of fun to read. And then the third book was a book called Necroscope by a guy named Brian Lumley, which is something of a horror classic if you're really into the genre of fiction. But again, it was written in the 80s, and in some ways it doesn't have a lot to do with Stranger Things. For one thing, it's Brian Lumley's an English author and it takes place in England and Europe, so it doesn't have the whole Americana vibe at all. But it is about a teenage psychic that is recruited as part of a Cold War program to fight the Russians, using psychics, which again, it's obviously this big Stranger Things theme. And also, when we talk about the upside down in Stranger Things, this book really delves deep into this sort of like supernatural other dimensions realm, which was, if that seems sort of novel to you, reading a lot of genre fiction in the 80s, that interdimensional weirdness was a big, thing that people, there was a big trope in a lot of horror novels at the time.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, and I want to ask your opinion, and again, this is your opinion. Do you think this TV show was made for this time? Because one thing that I talked about with Holly was, it's really interesting that we see this kind of like Americana 80s look of how the good old days were until now. So do you think this was on purpose?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously things are falling apart in this country socially and politically and other things like that right now. And this, and when you look at it that way, it's very hard to make contemporary horror of the same sort because, in order for you to be afraid, you often have to be afraid of like losing something, right? Mm-hmm. And if, there are no family structures and, all of our politicians are corrupt and we don't trust any of our institutions, and, including the local police, like the Black Lives Matter movement has made a big deal out of, like, if you don't trust any institutions and there's no families that you can latch onto and all these other things, it's very hard to effectively do horror because, well, you're kind of living in a horrible,
totally.
Situation as it is.
Totally. Yep.
So hearkening back to a time when, people could feel like they could lose their innocence, people could feel like they had something at stake if that was ever threatened by outside forces, be it the Russians or, secret government programs, or be it, supernatural creatures from another dimension. That's what the show is really trying to get back to. And I think that's why it struck a chord, because people, sort of instinctively, feel warm feelings for a period like that and want to fight for something that's at stake. Right.
Oh, yeah.
And you just, it's very hard anymore to create, movies and new heroes and all these other things where, we can all root for what's going on, which it's like all the comic book movies anymore. All of the Captain America stuff in the movies and stuff it's Captain America isn't fighting for America. He's fighting against his own government,
Yeah.
It's like a very bizarre situation to be in. Whereas if you just go back to the 80s, everything was clear in a lot of ways about good versus evil.
No, and I completely agree, and that's one of the topics I always have with my filmmaker friends. When we go to the movies, and especially when superheroes were created, it was because we wanted to escape reality, because we wanted to forget about what was happening, the depression, economic failure. And I see this, the creators of this TV show just made an amazing piece, and I want to end with this because I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more, because when I read Actually, I think it's your last sentence. Yes, it is your last sentence of your article. It just reminded me of Old America. And I quote, it says, If Stranger Things helps us return to a time when books about friendship, good versus evil, and pure imagination had a permanent home on the bestseller list, that can only be a good thing for readers.
We live in the age of the anti-hero. This has been something that's like particularly dominated television, everything from Breaking Bad to The Sopranos. It seems like the only way we can like effectively sort of mine any sort of meaning out of things is to make us relate to people doing bad things. And don't get me wrong. I think The Sopranos and Breaking Bad are fantastic shows, but it's kind of depressing when you step back and think about it, I think most of us want to have meaning in our lives. We don't want things to be spiritual empty, and we want to be fighting for things. And we want to be, seeing things and reading things that are spiritually enriching and make us want to go out there and make the world a better place. And even horror, can effectively do that, as I think Stranger Things proves. I just, that's why I like the show so much, and I'd like to get back to that, era where, like I said, could believe in good versus evil, and we had things that we cared about, be it our friends and family or whatever, to fight for.
No, I completely agree, and I'm only 26 years old, so this is kind of more the America that I know after 9/11. That's the only America I remember. Mark Holloway, he's a senior writer at the Weekly Standard. Make sure you follow him on Twitter at Heminator, like the Terminator, but with a Heminator. That's it for today, guys. Thank you for listening. And make sure to follow me on Twitter at RC_KRIS. And for more interviews next time, make sure to visit KrisCruzblog.com. That is KrisCruzblog.com. Till next time.